In this lecture for History 122, World Civilizations from 1600, Section 8, we will be discussing World War I and its aftermath. Now, normally, I would give you a set of objectives to begin with, but before I do that, I think I need to deal with some issues with World War I. I will sometimes call this World War I, but I'll also sometimes call it the Great War because, of course, people at the time period immediately after would not have thought of it as World War I since World War II had not happened. But there's this kind of stereotype when people look back at this war that the people then were just kind of dumb, and that World War happened in a sense because people were dumb. It went on for so long because people were dumb, and it killed so many people because people were essentially dumb. And I think this is problematic for several reasons. First, I just think it's inaccurate. As we'll see, these people were not dumb. They were very smart. And I would argue that, in fact, it's because, in a sense, they were too smart, and that's why the war would go on for so long. So it's just inaccurate. But also the problem is, if we just say, well, the war happened, a lot of people died because they were dumb, the assumption is that we're not dumb, so something like this could not happen because the essential cause was people being dumb. Well, as a historian, I am not convinced that people are any necessarily smarter today than they were in the past. I think that we maybe know more, but it's up to us whether we apply the lessons we've learned correctly or incorrectly. So rather than going into this war and saying, well, these people were dumb and that's why this happened, so what are we talking about? I want to rather explain how people who could be very smart could actually go to war. And in particular, I want to focus on, in many ways, how this was just a new kind of war. And that's, in a sense, what surprised people and why smart people were not able to figure a way out of this war without so much death and destruction. And of course, key if we want to prevent wars is to try and understand accurately the causes, why wars happened. Right, so that's why I really want to clear off, is when we look at this, I don't want us to see this as a story of dumb people just killing each other for no apparent reason. Rather, I think it's very smart people who found themselves in a difficult situation and found it hard to extract themselves from that situation. And it's good for us to study that and understand it so we can understand those causes so we can hopefully prevent wars in the future. And just to kind of give you kind of a preview of what I mean about these people not being dumb, this is a World War I soldier who fought for the British. That's him on the left during the war. He survived the war and became the man on the right. And I just want you to kind of take a second and see if you can guess who this person is. If you guessed that it was J.R.R. Tolkien, you would have been correct. This was indeed someone who fought in World War I and who survived, and whose literature, including The Lord of the Rings, you maybe haven't read the book, you maybe though have seen the movie. If you have not read the book or seen the movie, you need to do both. He also wrote The Hobbit as well. But he was someone who was deeply influenced by his experience in World War I. And I think if you watch these movies, and especially, or read the books, and you think about the battle descriptions, remember this was a guy who actually fought in battle who is writing these things. And he was deeply kind of connected to the war, shaped by the war, and he certainly was no dummy. To give you another example, you may have grown up reading the Chronicles of Narnia. There, of course, were also movies based on that. You had The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, as a book that was very popular among many people. Well, that was written by C.S. Lewis, who you might know. And C.S. Lewis was also deeply shaped by his time in World War I. He actually suffered a great deal. He was wounded seriously in the war, was almost killed, and was rotated back home and had to spend a lot of time in England and recovering. And it was very sad because his father, C.S. Lewis's mother, had died when he was just a child. His father had a drinking problem and was so depressed by the fact that his son had been wounded in battle that he became extraordinarily drunk for several months on end and was not actually able to visit his son, who was recuperating from a very serious wound. So C.S. Lewis suffered a lot, right? And again, if you read his books and watch the movies based on them, we have to remember this is coming from someone who experienced this war. And if you read C.S. Lewis's books, whether you agree or disagree with his ideas, he was a really, really smart guy. So again, we have this issue that I want to stress, that these were not dumb people. Now, if you're someone who doesn't find military history interesting, you might ask this question: why bother spending a whole section on World War I and its aftermath? And what I would respond is, well, the aftermath is not strictly speaking military history, so a lot of this section will not be about military history per se, but I'm trying to I have a broad view of the war, and I'm trying to give us a sense of how it has impacted even our lives today. And that was one reason I wanted to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, because both of them were deeply shaped by their experience in World War I, and many people today are still reading their books and studying them and talking about them and thinking about them, and they're an example of how World War I is with us in terms of how it shaped our popular culture. But to kind of get more deeply into that question, in terms of a historical kind of context, first of all, World War I will lead to the breakup of old empires and the formation of new nations. Right, so some countries that we're going to talk about, some like empires and some things during World War I that existed before World War I, but ceased to exist after World War I. In addition, without World War I, there would have been no World War II, no Nazis. For example, World War II in some ways is a continuation of World War I. And what's really important is in understanding this, people like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, the leader of two of the major Axis powers, they both experienced World War I. Adolf Hitler's experience in World War I was especially important, and many of their followers were veterans, and we'll talk more about that later on. The key thing is, without World War I, there would have been no World War II, there would have been no Nazis. Likewise, without World War I, there would probably not have been a successful communist revolution in Russia. There would have been no Soviet Union, and that means there would have been no Cold War. So much of history is going to be shaped by this war, and Middle Eastern politics would be completely different. World War I leads to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire that controlled much of the Middle East, and the Middle East will be carved up in a particular way that's going to lead to the development of the nation states that exist in the Middle East today, and at the time of this recording are kind of struggling, for example, Iraq and Syria. So things would have been completely different without World War I. So our objectives then, we're going to try and understand how the Great War, World War I, began. We're going to understand what happened when Europeans turned industrial weapons on each other. One thing I especially tried to emphasize in discussing the section on Africa and imperialism, remember I showed you that picture of the men with the rifles and the Maxim machine gun, and I emphasized how that gave them an advantage over Africans who often were not armed with such modern weapons. But here, both sides will have machine guns. Both sides will have rifles. We'll also understand how this war became a total war in which civilians became legitimate targets for violence. We will also try and understand how the war led to the destruction of old empires and the question of old beliefs. And finally, we will trace the victory of the liberal capitalist democracies after the war to the threat posed to them by the Great Depression. Now, before we talk about the direct causes of World War I, we need to understand a bit about what Europe was like before the war, before the Great War. So one thing we have to emphasize is that there were no major wars involving large alliances following the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815. Right? So World War I begins in 1914. So in other words, there had been almost a century of peace in Europe. Now, that's relative. We've talked about several wars. For example, the wars that led to the unification of Germany. And there certainly were wars in Europe. But the key thing is you do not have this kind of continent-wide conflagration that you had with the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were huge and involved almost every single European country for more than a decade. You don't have anything like that until 1914. The reason for this, in a large part, is what's called the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe. And you can kind of think about this to kind of help you remember. It's, you know how like when you have a orchestra and it gives a concert, and when the instruments all play their particular roles, when you have proper balance between instruments, you get nice music. You can kind of think of it that way. The Concert of Europe was diplomacy based around compromise to maintain a balance of power in Europe. Right? There's this kind of diplomacy based around compromise to maintain a balance of power. The idea is that when each European country, in a sense, knows its place and stays to its place, and there's a balance between them, there won't be a war, because people will not fight a war generally unless they think they can win. Right? As a general rule, people do not fight a war unless they think they can win. And if two sides are roughly equal, you're not going to have a war, because they will figure out some way to compromise because neither one is sure that they can win. So that's basically the idea. Whenever there was a crisis in Europe, European diplomats would come together and figure out some sort of compromise to maintain a balance of power. And the compromise was usually good enough, it was good enough compromise that people were not willing to risk a war to try and get something better, because their power was basically balanced. And you're not going to fight a war unless you think you have a possibility of winning. In fact, it was strong enough, this kind of concert of Europe, that was able to deal with the rise of Germany. We have to note that in the beginning of the 19th century, France was the greatest power in Europe. But it had been defeated by the Napoleonic Wars, and Germany, remember, which was a bunch of different states in Central Europe, had been unified under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, and had become much stronger than France and much stronger than Russia. And this is a kind of dangerous situation when you have the rise of a new power, because people aren't sure how to deal with it. It destabilizes the situation. It upsets the balance of power. But the concert of Europe, the dedication to diplomacy and compromise, was enough to maintain this balance of power. However, one thing that will eventually help lead to the war is, in a sense, Germany becoming overly ambitious. Otto von Bismarck was a really brilliant diplomat, and he knew not to push things too far. He was very good at avoiding pushing things too far. He really emphasized, for example, maintaining a good relationship with both France and Russia, and making sure in particular that Germany was never surrounded by France and Russia. They always had at least one friend, and traditionally that was Russia. Bismarck warned his successors, particularly Kaiser Wilhelm II, who we won't talk about too much, but he was the leader of Germany during World War I, that war would come to Germany if Germany followed expansionist policies that threatened other countries too much, right? That was his first prediction, that in a sense, if Germany tried to expand too much, then that would threaten the balance of power, and then other countries would unite to put Germany back in its place. And so he was always careful not to do that, to expand too much. He also predicted that when a war would eventually come, it would likely begin in the Balkans in the southeast of Europe. And he was right on both accounts. He actually predicted in 20 years, he told Kaiser Wilhelm II, if you continue to expand like this and follow these expansionist policies, there will be a war. And he was correct within about a month. And he was also right about where the war would begin. Right. So we have a Europe before World War I that had known mostly peace, with some exceptions, and had maintained this peace through a careful diplomacy based around compromise to maintain a balance of power, right? But what's going to kind of start upsetting this is this issue of the rise of a new power of Germany, which makes everyone nervous, right? How do you deal with this? And in the hands of people less capable than Bismarck, you will lead to this kind of Germany that is just going to expand without really caring what other people think, and that will help upset this balance of power. Now, again, this is very complex. How the World War I started was extraordinarily complex. I'm going to focus on what I think are 4 key causes. I want to stress these are not the only causes. And if you were to continue on taking history classes, that you will find someone who will give you much more complex, much more detailed causes. I'm going to give you some of the ones I think are the most important, right? So I want to stress this is not meant to be complete, but is meant to give you a sufficient understanding of what caused World War I. And this is important because, as I said earlier, this is often seen as an irrational war. And the problem is we could look at these people and say, well, they entered this war because they're irrational, because it is an irrational war. Who else would enter it but irrational people? But as I think I have shown, and I can, you can argue this with other examples, these people were not irrational. So if they weren't irrational, why did they enter the war? Well, the first cause I would argue is memory of previous wars. There is no one alive in Europe in this time period in a position of power that lived through the Napoleonic Wars. There's no one around in this time in Europe who remembers that period of continental conflagration when all of Europe was in arms and all the pain and suffering that came from that. Rather, the memory of wars during this time period is of limited wars that killed relatively few people. So, for example, remember, we talked about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. That was a key war in the establishment of Germany as a unified power. That war actually lasted only a little bit less than a year, even though it went over 2 years, and if you look at the actual duration, and relatively few people died. Remember, the Sino-Japanese War lasted about a year. The Russo-Japanese War lasted about a year. And even though the Russo-Japanese War did kill a fairly large number of people, it was nothing like the slaughter that was going to happen in World War I. So the key thing is you're more willing to go to war if you think the cost will remain relatively low. If Europeans had known that this war was going to kill 9 to 10 million soldiers and 5 million civilians, they probably would have not gone to war. They would have figured out a compromise. But they went into the war thinking, oh, this will be a war that will not last long and will not kill many people, because all the wars that we can remember did not last long and did not kill that many people. In addition, so that's cause one. In addition, cause two is nationalism. This is a time period of increasing nationalism. Many people identify with their nation state and believe that what is good for it is good for them, so they're willing to sacrifice everything for it. Right? If my nation state, if something good happens to it, if it prospers, that helps me. If something bad happens to it, that will hurt me. If my country is weak, people will beat up on me. If my country is strong, then people will not beat up on me. Right? Unfortunately, if you look at the behavior of countries to each other, a lot of times it's driven by whoever has the most power, and you want to have power or else people will bully you. So I want to be sacrificed for my country, to do whatever I can for my country, because ultimately whatever happens to it will affect me. If my country is strong, that helps me. If my country is weak, that hurts me. And I'm being very rational and very practical there, but there's also an emotional aspect to it, right? People really do love their countries. We really feel a debt to the people who sacrifice to establish and protect our countries. And that goes to the second point regarding nationalism. Once you start fighting, it's hard to stop because you do not want the dead to have died in vain, right? When we look back at this, we're like, geez, people keep dying. Why don't they just stop? Well, the argument that they would say is, people are dying, how can we stop? Right? If we lose this war, then our people will suffer. If we win this war, our people will prosper. And all these people have already died trying to win this war. If we give up now, it's like they died for nothing. So rather than saying a bunch of people died, let's stop. They say a bunch of people have died. My brother, my father, my husband, my son. We have to keep fighting because otherwise they died for nothing. So it makes it really difficult to stop the war because people, this is called kind of the sunk cost fallacy. We don't want to stop the war. We don't want to stop fighting because then it would mean the people who died in vain. We have to fight this through the finish. And if you've got one group of people who's willing to sacrifice everything for the good of their country, fighting another group of people who are willing to sacrifice everything for the good of their country, then a lot of people are going to die. And that's essentially what happens here. Now, as part of the concert of Europe, in a sense, there is established an alliance system, right? There's an alliance system to try and keep a balance of power. Balance of power is key because the idea is if people's power is balanced and it's not clear who is going to win a war, they are likely going to seek a compromise. That is a very logical, simple idea that I think is a very good argument. And this is essentially what the alliance system looks like before World War I begins. You have France, Russia, and Great Britain on one side. You have Germany, Switzerland, AustriaHungary on the other side. So you've got these nice two alliance systems, and there's a rough balance of power. It's not clear exactly who would win if they were to get into a fight, and ideally that will help maintain the balance of power. Now, one thing I just want to point out looking at this map, do notice that Germany is surrounded in a sense. Germany has a border with France and a border with Russia. So Germany would have to fight a two-front war, right? France only has to worry about enemies on one side of its country, on the east. Russia only has to worry about the west, but Germany has to worry about both west and east. So keep that in mind. That's why Otto von Bismarck really wanted to keep an alliance with Russia. So that way Germany would only have to worry about France, but unfortunately he will not be around to keep such an alliance. Now, that's the good thing about this. The bad thing is, once conflict begins, it is hard to stop. Right? So this system is great at preventing war, but if a war should happen, it's going to involve everyone, and it's going to be really hard to stop. Right? It's much easier to get two countries to compromise than it is to get 6 countries to compromise. Right? So this is going to work to keep the peace for a while, but the problem is, once a conflict begins, it is hard to stop. Right? It is very hard to stop. And as the final cause, I would say the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Right? We've talked about the Ottoman Empire before. It's often called the sick man of Europe. It's becoming weak. And what happens then is there's a competition between the semi-industrialized Russia and the semi-industrialized Austro-Hungarian Empire over former Ottoman territories. And if you look at this map, you can see Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Serbia, and so forth. As the Ottoman Empire becomes weak, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, or what I sometimes call the Austrian Empire in Russia, there's different ways you can refer to it. Austro-Hungarian is more correct, but it's harder to say. So I sometimes just say Austria or the Austrian Empire. They're going to be competing for power as the Ottoman Empire gets weaker. They want to control those territories. Making things even more complicated is the people who live in those areas want to have control over the territory themselves. And sometimes they're successful and are able to establish their own government. So one example of that would be the Serbs. They form Serbia. Now, this is going to be very complex, but please bear with me. Serbians are their own ethnic group. They want their own independent nation state. Remember, nationalism, the principle is one nation, one state. Okay, that's simple enough. But keep in mind, the Serbians were also considered Slavs, right? The Serbians were also considered Slavs, which is a larger kind of ethnic group, which Russia was also a member of. So you can kind of think about like Serbians are like the cousins of Russia, if that makes sense, right? If other Russians are their brothers and sisters, Serbians are their cousins. So they're related, not as closely related, but still related. So Russia considered itself the defender of the Serbs because they were fellow Slavs. So we've got this kind of competition over this territory between Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the people who live in the territory, some of whom would like to have independent nation states. Now, Serbia was fortunate in that it did get its own independent nation state. However, it wants all territory populated mostly by ethnic Serbs, right? Following the principles of nationalism, it wants all territory populated by ethnic Serbs. And there's a problem is that there are areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire bordering Serbia that have large number of Serbs, and the Serbs would certainly like that territory. So we have this kind of three-way competition for power and for territory and control over different ethnic groups between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which wants to become bigger, between Russia, which wants to become bigger, and with Serbia, which would like to get parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in which large numbers of Serbs live. And by the way, remember when I said that Otto von Bismarck predicted that something in the Balkans would cause the next war? This is the Balkans, right? This area of southeastern Europe, this is the Balkans. And again, this is where the war will, in a sense, begin. Now, the immediate cause of the war is that the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who would likely have become the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife are going to be assassinated by Serbians in the city of Sarajevo, which was Austrian territory that the Serbs wanted. Right? So to kind of repeat what happens here, you've got this very powerful, very high-ranking Austro-Hungarian official. He will probably become the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when the emperor ruling currently either abdicates or passes away. He was like 84 in this time period, so it seemed like he would be handing power over soon or dying, and then Franz Ferdinand would come into power. You've got this very powerful official next in line to become emperor of Austria, and he's assassinated. So that's a big deal. But what makes it even a bigger deal is that he's assassinated by Serbians on Austrian territory that the Serbs want. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire doesn't just think that these Serbians who killed the Archduke were just acting on their own. They think that the whole government of Serbia is also behind this, right? So this isn't just, oh, this guy killed our Archduke, what a terrible man. It's, no, this guy killed the Archduke, and this was something orchestrated by the government of Serbia. So Austria-Hungary is understandably very, very upset. So in response, the Austro-Hungarian Empire will make severe demands on Serbia. Will say to Serbia, hey, you have to do this, this, and this, and this to make up for this killing of our Archduke. And I want to stress the Austro-Hungarian Empire basically used this as a pretext to make Serbia, essentially it's almost a colony, right? So Austro-Hungary does have a legitimate reason for being upset with Serbia and the Serbian government, but it's going to use this as a pretext to try and gain control over Serbia. Remember, there's this competition in the Balkans for control, and Austro-Hungary wants to expand its control. Russia will oppose Austria-Hungary. It says these Slavs are our cousins. We are the defender of Serbia, and even though it's understandable that you were upset and that something needs to be done, Austria-Hungary, you're going too far. The Austro-Hungarians will go to Germany and say, will you back us against Russia? And Germany says, absolutely, positively, do whatever you think needs to be done. We have you 100%. And this is sometimes called the blank check, because basically Germany is saying, do whatever you want, Austria-Hungary, we've got your back. Then Russia and other countries will begin to mobilize, right? And by that I mean mobilize their armed forces. They'll start getting ready to fight because there's a fear that war might happen. And it's not just Russia. Remember, Russia is connected to other countries by treaty, by alliances, so they will start to kind of get ready for war. And they're afraid that if they don't act strongly, that will just lead Germany become even more powerful, right? Germany is this rising power in Europe, and there's this fear, if we let Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, do this and get away with it, that will just make Germany and its alliance with Austria-Hungary that much more powerful. And that's really bad. So all these countries afraid, particularly Russia, are afraid of Germany and afraid of it becoming too powerful. So Russia and these other Russia will start to mobilize its forces. This freaks out Germany, because remember, Germany has two fronts. Germany has to worry about the East and the West. France only has to worry about the East. Russia only has to worry about the West. So Germany says, you know what? If we just sit back and wait and let them mobilize their forces and attack us, we're going to get destroyed because we have to fight this two-front war. So Germany will declare war on Russia, and then the alliances will activate, right? So now it's not just a war between Austria and Serbia or Austria and Russia. It's going to be a war between multiple powers, right? So now the alliances are activated, and now we actually have fighting. Now, the sides are connected to the alliances, but not solely influenced by the alliances. So just to give you a sense of what the war is going to look like, on the Allied powers, you will have Great Britain, France, the Russian Empire, several Southeast European countries such as Romania, Serbia, and Greece. That will be one side. Italy, which had initially been allied with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, will actually switch sides and will be part of the Allies in this war. The Central Powers will consist of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Right, so those are the wars. Those are the sides, the Allied powers versus the Central Powers. But as you can see now, this is almost a complete war of all of Europe. Right, you can see some places like Spain, Albania, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands will be able to stay out of this war. But the vast majority of Europe's population will become involved in this war and will be directly affected by it.